Happy the pure in heart, they shall see God. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, O Lord.
The mother and brothers of Jesus arrived, and standing outside, sent in a message asking for him. A crowd was sitting round him at the time the message was passed to him. Your mother and brothers and sisters are outside asking for you. He replied, Who are my mother and my brothers? And looking round at those sitting in a circle about him, he said, Here are my mother and my brothers. Anyone who does the will of God, that person is my brother and sister and mother. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
We see how all hinges on the will. That famous expression of St Maximilian Maria Kolbe, when teaching his novices, put on the blackboard the mathematical formula for sanctity. It exists when tiny w equals, and insisted in all things equals, big W, the will. And so it is, there is freedom, and only in the divine will is that freedom found. And one is in bondage to one's own will as long as one has not made abdication over it and over all, in such a way that one thing matters, the divine will. It is the teaching given also by St Teresa of Avila. The state which most glorifies God is that of the soul which has no will or preference but that of the divine will. That holy indifference, la sainte indifférence, of which the French authors speak. And in the element of abdication, because one is wedded to the will that rules the world, history and providence, then all is a plus. One is on the winning side, because one has accepted a priori all with the quality of humour. Therefore, one is not in bondage to having to have such and such happen or else. The self-condemnation to unpeace of the vast majority of humankind. Actually, in that, strangely enough, we find an element in common with the spirituality of Hindu countries, for they, for centuries, have worked on the great enemy of the soul, which is desire. So, insofar as philosophy is a participation in divine Sophia, wisdom, that bit they have not got incorrect. There are certain extremes which rejoin each other. And as Thomas Aquinas was open-minded enough to see the semina verbi, the seeds of the word, all around, even in Aristotle, so we can do the same. Now, it's kind of important because we're only here once, and if we go into mode not existing on the level of the will, we are at last free. By the way, if one looks around, how many human tragedies does one see coming from one element which is very prevalent? A driving force of human comportment being ambition. A person who has no ambition but the divine will is on a very different plane. The person who is condemned to being unhappy unless his ambition is fulfilled might waste his only chance to be happy, the one life he had. St Patrick was in bondage at the age of 16 already, but he was free. His encounter with God in solitude was providential, and that providence never abandoned him. He was able to learn the language of these his captors. So further north from here, Saul, there in the mountains where he was tending sheep, and his body is nearby there. As you know, Down became Down Patrick after his body was placed there, but not on its own, placed with that of the other two principal patrons of this holy land, St Columcille, whose traces are in this area actually, notably Kells, and the saint of this day, Brigid, an extraordinary combination of holiness in one place. They are under the present sanctuary area of the Anglican Cathedral. On the very spot, and outside one sees this ancient stone with ancient script on it, going right back to the early centuries. Little primitive cross, and the word Patrick is quite clear. Now, I just want to quote something which our holy patron Patrick himself had to say when reporting on the situation that he was finding, because it is an evidence that when evangelization starts in a place, the old saying comes very much to the fore. One man and God is a majority. Remember, he was on his own. He had been, after escaping from his captivity, able to get formed in the whole ambit of continental sanctity, places like Les Reims, still there to this day, off the south coast of France, a monastic island, where the likes of St John Cassian had been, transmitting therefore the best of the Eastern spirituality. And unexpectedly, because the initial choice of the Pope had been Palladius as the evangelizer of Ireland, but he had died after about a year, and attention was providentially drawn towards Patrick, who happened to be around, young enough, fresh enough, and above all, aware enough of what was in the balance, because inculturation is the key to evangelization, and he was the man who was chosen to be bishop for the Irish. So bringing in his person the grace of the episcopacy, he was able to transmit grace, and of course he did so in this very spot, insofar as he chose one of his favourite disciples, Keenan, to be founding bishop in this area, this village of Dulique, according to tradition the first stone-built church in the land. and therefore we are standing on holy ground. It's that close to St Patrick. 489 is the date of the death of St Keenan, but already in 450 he would have been around. Therefore, we are doing what has been done here before, and the old ruins recognize the echo. So this is the Patrick that was able to spread the rays of healing grace and Orthodox faith, using precisely this element of complete culture which Providence had given him. For before his captivity he had also the good patrician upbringing from wherever he was in Wales or Cumbria or Cornwall, not quite sure the exact birthplace, but it's somewhere around there, of Latin parents. And he had the Latin education, which comes forth precisely in what we're about to quote here in translation, because the Confessions and all he wrote was in good classical Latin, the language of culture and communication in the whole Western world. And we're still using, to this day, the Roman canon in the West, as well as any new translations, or not translations, but fabrications, which we're allowed to use also. But the Roman canon was the canon used way back, and we have it in common with the Celtic Church. For all that depended on Rome eventually had certain liturgical books coming from Rome, especially the Eucharist itself. There are variants in the liturgical observances. As we know, it led to eventually the whole thing being solved at the Synod of Whitby, but nevertheless Latin was the language of the worship. One differentiation would have been the very large number of psalms used in the Celtic Church, whereas St Benedict, giving the Roman impetus of simplification and legislation, temperateness, reduced it to 150 psalms a week and not 150 psalms a day. Listen then to what he has to say, which is relevant to this particular feast. He is reflecting on, of course, the way that eventually the worship of stones and idols has given place to the building of churches and places of prayer. Quoting the prophet Osee, "I will call that which was not my people, and her that had not obtained mercy, one that has obtained mercy. And it shall be in the place where it was said, you are not my people, there they shall be called the sons of the living God." Hence, how did it come to pass in Ireland that those who never had a knowledge of God, but until now always worshipped idols and things impure, have now been made a people of the Lord, and are called sons of God? That the sons and daughters of the kings of the Irish are seen to be monks and virgins of Christ. Among others, a blessed Irish woman of noble birth, beautiful, full-grown, whom I had baptized, came to us after some days for a particular reason. She told us that she had received a message from a messenger of God. Now, messenger of God would be an angel of God, angelos, coming from the Greek, to announce, is someone who brings a message. And it comes from the equivalent of the notion in Hebrew, which is maleach. Therefore, when we talk about messengers in the mind of these people, we're talking about angels. She told us that she had received a message from a messenger of God, and he admonished her to be a virgin of Christ and draw near to God. Now, it's all there. It's very quaint. It's typically Celtic. It's very homely. Draw near to God. That was the only program that he had. Be free, therefore, to draw near to God. Taking up by that the doctrine given by St Paul as he writes to the Corinthians in the first epistle in the 7th chapter. The whole notion of the urgency, because time is short, in the context there of the expected parousia, but it's always short. That there's a certain urgency, and therefore one can question the validity of a choice to expend all one's time and energy towards the material. And St. Paul clearly indicates, without any obligation whatsoever, that he who opts or she who opts for marriage does well, but he who opts or she who opts for freedom in the Lord does better, because he indicates the one is divided, the other is totally concentrated on the Lord. So whatever one says, it is true. And it was perceived to be true. It was perceived to be true actually even earlier on than this in Christian history. We have evidence from early writings that when it came to baptism, those who proclaimed publicly their choice to give themselves as virgins to the Lord were the first to be baptized, because there was a double consecration going on in their case. And we know also from evidence that the veil was the sign of that consecration, and it comes through in early mosaics. If one goes to the north of Italy, one finds very early mosaics in the area of Ravenna and Milan, and what one would find would be a contemporary one of the great Bishop of Milan giving the veil to his sister, St. Marcella. So it is the Ordo Virginum. And one can say that in practice it is as old as Christianity itself, at least in its thrust. Now there are authors who look into that first epistle to the Corinthians and analyze the actual expressions used by St. Paul, because they're difficult to understand. And the author that I base a lot of my Lectio Divina on here, Zerwick, a great Jesuit, who was writing in the 1950s. It's a book I have here which goes through every single Greek word in the New Testament at its place, and it's written in Latin but with all kinds of other languages put in, so as to find always the closest equivalent in any living language. It's a very good masterly work. It's not been outdone by any other. And he, at one point, going into this first epistle, analyzes, is it possible that the notion of virgines sub introducte is already present there at this stage? This means that what could have been happening, possibly, is that there were some girls who were opting for a situation of being protected by a juridically stable situation, might be marriage, but not consummating the union. And they would be called virgines sub introducte. So it's possible, he doesn't say anything, but he points out that this could be an explanation for what's going on. Anyway, the thrust is the same. Because if one is in a situation of stability without children, there is a semi-monastic state of life starting there. The domestic church. Now, I just want to go on because it goes on in this vein, indicating the power of the grace of God to bring out the best of this neo-Christian nation, hardly converted from paganism. Thanks be to God, he says, on the 6th day after this, she most laudably and eagerly chose what all virgins of Christ do. Not that their fathers agree with them, no. They often even suffer persecution and undeserved reproaches from their parents. And yet their number is ever increasing. Now, in the specific case of this Holy Virgin, although she was born further north towards Dundalk at Fohart, she did go down to Kildare and collaborated with a holy bishop of the area, St Conleth, in diffusing the Word of God. According to tradition, she made use of these homemade crosses out of reeds in the form that we know, the St Brigid's cross, and able to use, rather like St Patrick, this indication that the three persons of the Trinity are all one. And they have been used over the centuries, blessed on this day, and placed especially in agricultural situations to ask for protection for the land and the animals and the household. Ireland is still a very green country compared with some, and agriculture is still very important. And therefore, one is often asked to pray still for animals and even to bless them, because it's the livelihood of the people. Even here, every morning a farmer comes, and this element of being close to nature is part of the Irish culture. We depend on the animals sometimes, and therefore we're aware of our poverty. We have to help each other, man and animal together, and they depend on us for their health and well-being. Now, I just want to conclude on one point which is linked. It's the aberration of femininity. For in this consecration of true womanhood, we find the highest form of human life for the female. It's important that a woman realizes that she is not a failed male. She has her own superiority in certain areas, the which would give her her true dignity and glory. Who on earth was or ever shall be more glorious than the Blessed Virgin herself? But she was not a priest, and she would have been had the Lord wanted that to be the case. She was the supreme human being who, in conformity to the divine will, disappeared. Ecce ancilla Domini. And the reversal of that is when a woman wants to come out of the glorious angelic role that she has on earth to assume one that is not hers, and to make herself unhappy because she's not satisfied with the blessing that is supremely present already. If one looks around, one sees over the last half century an evolution. In childhood and youth, I would have been exposed to the presence of the Catholic Church, and in our own church growing up in Cardiff, a very big Benedictine church, there were quite a few convents, all served by the brethren, because there were 6 or 7 brethren or priests going around at the early hours of the morning, celebrating as well as in the church itself. And in fact, I used to go to one of the convents rather than the parish church on a weekday. And growing up, therefore, as it was in school days, close to these little angels, they were always there, fluttering around. They would sing quite often. They would pray. They had great care for the things of the Lord. Most of them were of Irish stock and even of Irish accent. But they were not contaminated. They were pure Irish goodness, and they were angelic because they were what they were. They exploited the grace of their state and didn't want more. Down the line, observing what has happened, not everywhere by any means, certainly not everywhere, but quite often there has been a very different mode of operation within the female sphere of consecrated life. It hasn't paid off, because where that has happened, the Lord has not blessed them. They are drying up. Whereas the vocations are coming now in precisely those areas where the desire of the Lord is being honoured. Often in mixed communities, actually, or new versions, where the brethren can help the sisters. But it's there. And this false notion of womanhood, as though the only true woman was the virile half-man, is an aberration of the project of the author of beauty itself. There is a complementarity on earth. We don't want everyone to be a unisex species never invented by anyone but man, or at least woman herself. There's one great fault in the spiritual life and in human life in general. It's narcissism. A person who is so absorbed with his or herself that he has the impression, as St Thomas More puts it, the whole of the cosmos has nothing better to do than to sing an eternal sanctus around his head.